In this episode, we're going to make symmetric cryptography feel clear and practical by focusing on what it is, what it's good at, and how people accidentally break it even when they use strong algorithms. Symmetric cryptography is the workhorse behind most modern encryption because it's fast and efficient, which makes it suitable for protecting large amounts of data in transit and at rest. The tricky part is that encryption strength is not only about picking a reputable algorithm, it's also about how you manage keys and how you use encryption modes, which are the patterns that describe how the algorithm is applied to real data. Beginners sometimes hear that a certain algorithm is strong and assume that's the end of the story, but many real incidents happen because the algorithm was used incorrectly. Our goal is to build a mental model that separates the core idea of symmetric encryption from the common misuse patterns that silently undermine confidentiality and integrity. Once you have that model, you'll be able to understand why certain configurations are dangerous and why good cryptography is as much about disciplined usage as it is about mathematics. A strong starting point is to define symmetric cryptography in plain language. It's encryption where the same secret key is used to encrypt and decrypt data. If two parties share the same key, one can encrypt a message and the other can decrypt it, and anyone without the key should not be able to recover the original content. This shared secret design is what makes symmetric encryption fast, because it avoids the heavier calculations used in other cryptographic approaches. Symmetric encryption is used for things like protecting files on disk, encrypting database contents, and securing the bulk data of network connections once an initial secure channel is established. The central challenge is the key itself, because both parties must have it, and if the key is exposed, the confidentiality collapses immediately. Beginners often underestimate how hard key sharing can be at scale, and that challenge is why symmetric encryption is often paired with other mechanisms for key exchange. But at the level of understanding symmetric cryptography, the most important mental anchor is that the key is the secret, and everything depends on keeping that key protected. Keys in symmetric cryptography are not just passwords, they are typically high-entropy values designed to resist guessing. A strong key should be generated randomly, stored securely, and rotated when necessary to reduce risk over time. The goal of randomness is to prevent attackers from being able to brute force the key by trying likely values. When people generate keys poorly, such as by using predictable patterns or deriving keys from weak user-chosen passwords without proper strengthening, they can undermine strong encryption. Another common key management mistake is reusing the same key too broadly, such as using one key for many systems or for long periods, which increases the impact if the key is compromised. The more you reuse a key, the more ciphertext an attacker can collect, and the more opportunity they have to exploit mistakes in usage. Even if the algorithm is sound, poor key management turns symmetric encryption into a fragile control. This is why security discussions about encryption often shift quickly into discussions about key storage, access control, and lifecycle. Now let's introduce the idea of modes, because modes are where many beginner misunderstandings begin. Symmetric algorithms often operate on fixed-size blocks of data, but real data is not neatly divided into perfect blocks. Modes define how those blocks are processed and how patterns are prevented from leaking through. If you were to encrypt each block independently in a naive way, identical blocks of plaintext would produce identical blocks of ciphertext, which can reveal patterns to an attacker. Modes are designed to avoid that by mixing blocks together or by introducing additional values that change the encryption behavior across the message. Some modes are designed primarily for confidentiality, while others also provide integrity protection. The important beginner lesson is that the algorithm plus the mode is what determines security properties. You can use a strong algorithm in a weak or misused mode and end up with a system that leaks information or is vulnerable to manipulation. A concept closely tied to modes is the idea of an initialization vector, often shortened to IV. An initialization vector is a value used to ensure that encrypting the same message twice with the same key produces different ciphertext each time. This matters because predictable ciphertext patterns can leak information about repeated content, especially in structured data like documents, images, or protocol messages. A critical rule is that the initialization vector should not be reused in ways that break the security assumptions of the mode. Depending on the mode, The initialization vector may need to be unpredictable or at least unique for each encryption operation. Beginners often assume the initialization vector is secret like a key, but it is typically not required to be secret. It's required to be used correctly. The mistake is not exposing the initialization vector. The mistake is reusing it or generating it predictably when the mode expects uniqueness or unpredictability. When the initialization vector is mismanaged, encryption can leak patterns or become vulnerable to attacks that recover information from the ciphertext. Another important idea is that encryption alone does not automatically give you integrity, and this is a common misuse that breaks security in subtle ways. If you encrypt data without integrity protection, an attacker might be able to modify the ciphertext in transit, causing controlled changes in the decrypted plaintext. This can lead to attacks where the attacker cannot read the message but can still influence it, which can be just as dangerous depending on the context. To address this, modern designs often use authenticated encryption, which combines confidentiality and integrity so the receiver can detect tampering. When authenticated encryption is used correctly, modified ciphertext will fail verification, preventing the attacker from injecting altered content. Beginners sometimes assume that if data is encrypted, it must also be protected from modification, but that is not guaranteed unless integrity is explicitly provided. This is why the distinction between confidentiality and integrity matters in cryptography discussions. Symmetric cryptography can support both, but you must choose mechanisms that include both properties, not just secrecy. A common misuse pattern involves reusing keys and nonces in ways that violate the design assumptions of certain modes. A nonce is a number used once, and in many authenticated encryption schemes, uniqueness is essential for security. If a nonce is reused with the same key, attackers may be able to recover information about the plaintext or even the key in some cases, depending on the scheme. This kind of mistake happens in real systems because developers try to simplify code, reuse values for convenience, or fail to understand that uniqueness is part of the security guarantee. Another misuse is using predictable nonces, which can weaken certain security properties or allow replay and pattern attacks. The key beginner takeaway is that many modes and schemes have strict rules about uniqueness and randomness, and violating those rules can break security even if the underlying algorithm is strong. Cryptography often fails at the edges, not in the core math. It's also important to understand that symmetric encryption can be used for data at rest and data in transit, but the operational risks differ. For data at rest, the main risk is key storage and access control, because if an attacker steals the key from a system, they can decrypt everything stored. For data in transit, the risks include key negotiation, session management, and ensuring integrity against tampering. In both cases, key rotation and compartmentalization help reduce blast radius, because you do not want one key compromised to expose all data everywhere. Another operational consideration is that encryption is only as effective as the systems around it. If plaintext is exposed in memory, written to logs, or handled insecurely before encryption, confidentiality can be lost even if encryption is strong during storage or transit. Beginners sometimes focus on the encryption step itself and forget about how data is handled before and after. A mature understanding treats encryption as part of a data lifecycle rather than a single magical transformation. Another misuse that breaks symmetric encryption in practice is implementing cryptography yourself instead of using vetted implementations and established patterns. People sometimes try to create their own encryption method or combine algorithms in unusual ways, believing they're adding security, but they often introduce subtle weaknesses. Even when using a strong algorithm, small mistakes in padding, mode selection, randomness generation, or error handling can create vulnerabilities. Attackers look for these implementation mistakes because they are often easier to exploit than brute forcing a key. This is why secure systems rely on well-studied cryptographic libraries and standard constructions, and why security reviews pay close attention to how encryption is used, not just what algorithm name is mentioned. For beginners, the key lesson is humility. Cryptography is unforgiving, and the safest path is to follow well-established usage patterns. Strong cryptography is less about creativity and more about disciplined correctness. As we conclude, remember the core story of symmetric cryptography. It uses a shared secret key to provide fast, efficient protection of data, but that protection depends heavily on correct key management and correct mode usage. Keys must be generated with strong randomness, stored securely, and not reused too broadly, because key exposure collapses confidentiality immediately. Modes and related values like initialization vectors and nonces determine whether encryption leaks patterns or resists tampering, and reusing these values in forbidden ways can silently break security. Encryption alone does not guarantee integrity, so authenticated encryption or related integrity mechanisms are needed when you must detect modification. Many real-world failures come not from weak algorithms, but from misuse, such as poor randomness, key reuse, nonce reuse, and homegrown implementations. If you keep these principles clear, you'll be able to recognize why secure systems insist on careful key handling and standardized constructions, and you'll be ready to understand how asymmetric methods solve the key sharing problem that symmetric encryption naturally creates.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.